everyone. I'm Sue Colley, and I'm here today with Judy, Vashti, Persad, and Carolyn Egan, who are both longtime organizers of the International Women's Day Rally and March in Toronto and members of Women Working with Immigrant Women. They speak of their experiences of building an anti-racist women's movement in the 80s and 90s, along with the work of many others. This resulted in the most diverse, broad-based, vibrant, and continuous International Women's Day rallies and marches in North America, with the leadership of Black, Indigenous, South Asian, Asian, and other women of color. The events bring thousands into the streets every year with an anti-racist, anti-heterosexist class perspective, fighting for a better world for all. I'm very pleased to have with us today Carolyn Egan, who has for many, many years been with the International Women's Day Committee, and Judy Persad, who was also for many, many years with the International Women's Day Committee and with Women Working with Immigrant Women. So perhaps you two would both like to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll start with some questions.
Well, I am Carolyn Egan, as you said, and I was involved in the initial 1978 International Women's Day, and I'm also active in the union movement, pro-choice movement, reproductive justice, and that's about it, I guess.
Hi, I'm Judy, Vashti Persad, and I entered the IWD scene around 1986, that wonderful year. I've worked with anti-racist organizations, women's organizations, Cross-Cultural Communication Center, Women Working with Immigrant Women, and also within the labor movement and just with the broader social justice movement. So it's great to be here. Thank you for asking.
We could start out, as you suggested, by talking about the origins of International Women's Day March and Rally in Toronto. And I imagine, Carolyn, you'd like to start with that, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, thinking back to 1977, that's when the idea came to start organizing again for International Women's Day. And I think that it was a small group of about 10 or so women, mostly socialist feminists. And we felt that it was really important to bring back the energy and the militancy of the movements of the 60s, when the women's liberation movement, the Black Power movement, the anti-war movement, the gay liberation movement, the American Indian movement were in the streets fighting strongly for demands and winning. And we felt that we had to respond to things that were going on in the newspaper, the media, that the women's movement was dead, feminism has achieved what it needs, we don't need it anymore, which was such a ridiculous concept because women's liberation was far from won. And I think we also wanted to get back to the roots of International Women's Day. I mean, it was declared in 1910 by Clara Zetkin and other socialist women in Europe, and it was commemorating the strikes and the walkouts, the marches that immigrant women garment workers had been involved in earlier, a few years earlier than that, in New York City, fighting for better working conditions, for better pay, and for dignity and respect that they clearly deserved in their workplace. And also that was echoed in, I think it was 1912 in Lawrence, Lowell, Massachusetts, when thousands of women workers struck against the robber barons in the mills there. And they organized, they fought, self-organized, and speaking 22 different languages, they were able to bring unity and fight and win. And I think that was the spirit, to bring class issues back into the women's movement in a way that made a real difference. So we felt, let's give it a try. We decided to aim high, and we called a meeting, and 200 women came out, which was just dynamite. It was just so exciting. And we felt that this was something we could proceed with. A lot of debates, discussions. And one of the key debates was whether we should have a march and rally that was within sort of the self-defined feminist community, women only, or should we broaden it out and have trade unions involved, immigrant communities involved, and make it a very large event if we could. And that was the decision that was made in the end. And as I say, we were aiming high. We chose to rent Convocation Hall at University of Toronto, and that 1,700, 2,000 people, something like that, it holds. So a lot of organizing was going on, getting the speakers, all of that. And I remember the day of the event itself, we were there, and whether it was for 11 a.m., I don't know, but 11 a.m. came, And we were there, the speakers were there, and barely anyone else. And it was like, oh my heavens, like we maybe overstretched ourselves here. But I remember Jess McKenzie, one of the organizers, would come running in saying, they're coming. And the hall over a matter of minutes just filled up. And it was just a very exciting event. And speakers, they put forward their issues, they spoke, we went into the streets, there was a very dynamic march. And interestingly enough, one of the issues that the media really picked up on was the deportation of Jamaican mothers. Sharona Hall from that committee was one of the speakers. So it set a real marker in many senses. And since '78, we've had marches and rallies. This year's one that was virtual. But last year, 11,000 were in the streets, and it was hugely successful. But there was a real problem. And the problem was that it was not diverse, it was not representative, and it really didn't reflect the women of Toronto and all the struggles that were going on in the way it should have. And the deportation of Jamaican mothers was one issue among 7, if I'm remembering properly, and I think it was a 6th. And there was no appreciation that racism profoundly affected all of the issues that we were organizing around. And I think if you look at childcare, if you look at violence against women, workplace concerns, whatever, the impact on Black women, Indigenous women, South Asian women, Chinese women, all women of color was profoundly different than the impact on white women. And no matter if they were all from the working class, no matter what. And that had to be dealt with, it had to be recognized, and an anti-racist class perspective had to come forward. And so that was something that had to be learned. And I think that racism is a huge barrier to unity in the women's movement, any movement. And I think that through that experience, if you are going to build a unified movement that really took on the state, that took on the corporations, took on capitalism, if you will, that maintains racism and all the exploitations and the oppression, then it has to integrate an anti-racist perspective. And if we were going to build an inclusive movement, we had to learn that lesson, and really there had to be the broad participation and leadership of racialized women if we were going to fight and win. I mean, the March 8th Coalition took up issues. For example, in the next year, '79, the Pure Tech strike, which is a strike of immigrant women garment workers, was it led the march. But again, it was one issue, one campaign, and there was no integration, and that was a real problem. And
so, Carolyn, can I ask, why do you think that was?
I think because
they were socialist feminist women, presumably had an an anti-imperialist, anti-racist perspective, but why do you think that the movement started out with basically being, well,
I think it was women? just a lack of understanding of how important it was and how critical it was if you were going to build a real movement, as I say, that was going to be effective, and not that it was entirely white, but it was way majority white. There was no two ways about it. And I think that had to change. And frankly, it was the work of women of color, racialized women, that began that process. I mean, Sharona continued on, and in a few years later, in 1981, 2 organizations, Women Working with Immigrant Women and the Coalition Against the Marcos Dictatorship, chose to come into the coalition as organizations. And WWIW had women from a lot of different backgrounds. Maria Teresa Lorraine was the coordinator at that point. A number of the activists who came in were from Latin America. They had become political refugees to this country, fighting the dictatorships in their own country, and encountered all kinds of racism, discrimination, bigotry. And the Coalition Against the Marcos Dictatorship, most of the women were from the Philippines. They were fighting the Marcos dictatorship at home. They were working here as well. And they were working particularly in the areas of caregivers and domestic workers. And they raised this issue. If you were going to be a representative movement, you had to really take on the inequities that racism created and change the structures, change the way you deal with issues, change the whole programmatic approach, the organizational approach, and it had to change in significant ways. And where we has always had a a trade union outreach committee, because there were many women from the trade unions, working class women in the coalition, and they initiated an immigrant women's outreach committee, and that with others developed leaflets particularly geared to those communities, and this was a process of change that had to take place, and women had to learn and unlearn. And I think there was as you say, a theoretical understanding of the need to fight racism and fight colonialism and imperialism, absolutely. But when it came down to the actual doing of it, it wasn't happening, and that's where the problem lie. And as I say, WWIW played a very significant role in this, and Salome Lucas, who when Maria Teresa stepped down, she became the coordinator of WWIW, and she interestingly had been one of those pure tech strikers back in '79, and she took on a very significant leadership role. And as time went on, Judy came into the coalition as well, and the two of them really were very strong leaders pushing this process, and it was a hugely important process that I think has made a real difference as time has gone on in the way the coalition functions, who leads the coalition, and the issues that are highlighted. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was a wonderful synopsis of, what was it? Almost 10 years. Oh, more than 10 years,
Well,
really.
Yes.
Could have done an awful lot more, but I didn't want to overdo it.
You are so good at this, Carolyn. You are amazing. I can't believe it.
But Carolyn, how do you describe that 11 o'clock and no one there and just waiting?
Yeah.
I could just feel it. And then when you saw the streams of people coming in, I had to like wipe my eye there a little bit, because I felt that relief and excitement. So that was wonderful.
Thank you for saying that, because sometimes you just have to take leaps of faith. You just have to, let's do it, let's try it, and let's go. And if we fail, we fail, but we got to try. And thank heavens it worked out.
And I think movements reflected what was also in society, the structures in society, and movements prioritize transformation and change and fighting for social justice. But you still have to face the structures and the same, I guess, oppression or barriers that you see in society. And the thing is, movements then needed to make the commitment to transform. So it may have been theoretical, but I think the commitment and the work that it took, that was the step that was needed. So, but that was great, Carolyn.
For sure, absolutely.
So Judy, when did you first get involved, and how did you perceive this problem, and come to terms with how you might address it?
Well, I'll start a little bit with women working with immigrant women, because for me, that was part of my entry point into Toronto. I had just was in Toronto about 2 years. I just finished university, and now getting involved in the movement. So I think I'd like to talk a little bit about WWIW, because it really had a key role. And I mean, WWIW it was created in 1974, and it was created as a network for community workers and community-based agencies who worked with immigrant women. And it was, a way to bring people together to have some sort of a collective action in pushing for services and programs and engaging in political action around the needs of immigrant women. So that's why the organization was formed.
What kinds of organizations were part of women working with immigrant women?
I could just mention some. Carolyn can add to more there, but Working Women Community Center, Immigrant Women's Health Center, I think Rexdale Women's Center.
Yeah.
Carolyn, do you want to add others?
Yeah, there were a whole range of groups that don't exist now. I think the Immigrant Women's Health Center was called something different at the time, and varying collectives of women who were fighting on different issues, the Latin American Women's Collective, et cetera. And I think Cross-Cultural Communication Center had a
Yes.
role in that as well. So many different groupings from different communities. And, you know, when specific struggles would come up, like, for example, the deportation of Jamaican mothers, people would connect, you know, to the network then as well.
Yes. And WWIW, I mean, this is actually, it was something exciting happening at that time, because WWIW was part of this alternative women's movement that existed, and other organizations that, you know, it was being created. So you would have, and I'll refer to Women Working with Immigrant Women as WWIW. And Immigrant Women's Health Center, they started in 1974. And then you had the Working Women Community Center in 75, Rexdale Women's Center in 79, I believe, and the Coalition of Visible Minority Women in 1983. So here you had the development of organizations geared to meet the needs of immigrant women, to advocate for immigrant women and women of color at that time. And it was an alternative women's movement. We also had a provincial organization called the Organization of Immigrant and Visible Minority Women of Ontario. And then there was a national organization, the National Organization of Immigrant and Visible Minority Women of Canada. And these were all part of this alternative women's movement. And that speaks to the need that was there. The movement was not appropriately addressing and pushing for, you know, advocating for the needs of immigrant women and women of color. So this movement was forming, and you know, it was exciting to be a part of that. Women Working with Immigrant Women had a major role in those provincial and national organization. And I think, you know, when you look at the projects that WWIW did, they were quite groundbreaking. I mean, in 1983, I think in the early 80s at least, Women Working with Immigrant Women worked with the Cross-Cultural Communication Center to start the Shirley Samaru House. And this was a shelter for immigrant women escaping violence. That was groundbreaking at that time. Actually, it still is. You know, and together with the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, OCASI, they organized a citywide forum focusing just on immigrant women's issues and needs. In the early 90s, it created a handbook called Towards, I think it was Developing an Anti-Racism Action Plan. And this was a handbook that it was developed for community workers in service organizations. They could use this handbook to work towards implementing anti-racist policies and practice within the organization. So those were three projects that, you know, from the start that we were involved in. But I think something that's also important is that WWIW made the conscious political decision to, yes, work within the immigrant and women of color communities, but also work with broader movements such as the women's movement and the labor movement. And this was not a decision that was made by all organizations. Some organizations just work within the communities they were a part of and represented, and that was great. And WWIW made that decision because we saw that to really create change and systemic change, it was important to join with other progressive movements. And yes, there were challenges within those movements, as we know and we're going to talk about, but we made the decision to be a part of it and work within it to change the structures, policies, and practices within it, to be a part of it, to advocate on a larger collective level. So in 1984, Women Working with Immigrant Women joined the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. And that was a national excuse me, Organization for Women in Canada. And later on, we pushed for the creation of a committee called the Visible Minority Women and Immigrant Women's Committee. And, the reason we pushed for that was, again, to have a collective visibility within an organization where our numbers were few. So it was a way to build power within NAC. And one of the resources that we created was towards an anti-racism women's movement. And this, provided a guide for a way forward for NAC to transform itself. It spoke about changing policies and practices within NAC, that it can be more accessible, more representative, really to integrate an anti-racist perspective within that organization. Again, WWIW, I tell you, this is why I stayed with and was a part of WWIW for so long, because we did exciting work. And while I was there, Salome was the staff there, and it was just exciting to work with her, and just just do this work in all the different movements, and still to connect with organizations within the people of color, women of color, and immigrant communities. And one of the projects we did that was, it's a study. It's called No Hijab is Permitted Here. And I put that in quotes because that is the title of the study. And we worked with Canadian Arab Federation, the Council of Muslim Women, the Federation of Muslim Women, Canadian Auto Workers, and United Steelworkers of America, Carolyn's union. So here we were bringing together these different sectors, and the study was to focus on the experiences of women, Muslim women, wearing hijab when applying for work within the manufacturing, sales, and service sectors. And it documented, and the No Hijab is Permitted Here was something they heard when they were applying. And the study, it was a small study, but it clearly showed the discrimination that was experienced, and it documented the Islamophobia that these women experienced. And this was probably in the late 90s or early 2000s. But that was not something that was spoken about a lot in the media, in the mainstream. So it was quite exciting to do that project with these groups. Another project we did was with the labor movement, working with different unions to document the history and the organizing of workers of color within the labor movement, and how workers of color were pushing for change within the labor movement. And this, again, Salome and I wrote that resource. And actually, I'll just show a picture of it here so I can get that to you also, Sue. And it's called Through the Eyes of Workers of Color, Linking Struggles for Social Justice. So again, this was an incredible project, and groundbreaking again. And just, it was so important to document, just as I guess you are doing in your project here, it was so important to document the experiences of workers of color, and many of them women of color. So those are some of the work that WWIW did. So it gives you a history of where we're coming from. And then, Carolyn mentioned by 1981, I believe, WWIW joining the March 8th Coalition. And this was to bring a voice of immigrant women and women of color to the March 8th Coalition. And, there was, I think they spoke out about the approach that the coalition, the single issue approach that Carolyn mentioned, that the coalition was taking. That was the first year, as we mentioned, that there was a leaflet, materials in different languages other than English. There was also the Immigrant Women's Committee formed that year. A few years later, 1984, I want to read this because this was in the leaflet that came out in 1984. This year, we are highlighting the experiences and the struggles of minority, Native, immigrant, and poor women. In addition to fighting the worst of sexist discrimination, we also confront racial discrimination on a daily basis. So, this was another step, an important step in transforming the March 8th Coalition. One small step, but a step that's necessary, transforming the March 8th Coalition so that it can become a little more representative, a little more welcoming to communities who had historically been excluded. So, I mean that gives a little history of WWIW and our entrance into the March 8th Coalition.
So you brought us up to 1984 when?
So in 1986, racism was still not seen as a major concern for the women's movement. And yes, issues they were covered. But when you look at who determined the political direction of the March 8th Coalition, it was still white women. And, when women of color were chosen as speakers, or if they participated in the coalition, it was, the Native woman, the Indigenous woman, the Black woman, the South Asian woman. And it was always the other. It was still, we were the other. And this needed to change. I mean, if the women's movement was to be a movement to represent all women, there had to be change. It had to reflect and incorporate the lived realities of all women, the lived realities of Indigenous women, of Black women, of South Asian women. And yes, we also group as women of color, but each of these communities have their own unique historical reality with the country and the society, with the movement. So it just had to be incorporated. And this was a challenge that was put forward in 1986. The challenge to change.
I would say a process had begun to do that, and that was because of WWIW and the coalition against the Marcus dictatorship, and I would say, the work of people like Sharona from the Committee Around the Deportation. So that was a process that was beginning, but as Judy was saying, racism had to be taken on full square, and I think that's what 86 and WWIW was one of the initiators of that. Because the theme was no to racism from Toronto to South Africa, because a huge struggle was going on in South Africa, and that was to be the entire theme of the day, and that was a big change as I remember it, and that was initiated by a group of women who got together. WWIW called that meeting, if I remember, Judy, if that's correct. And groups
yes.
like the Latin American Women's Collective and the African Ethiopian Hunger Campaign, and the there's a whole range, WWIW. There's a whole range of color organizations that came together. Initially met with WWIW and IWDC, which was a separate organization but was part of the organizing, and that's what was put forward. That's my memory of it, Judy.
Yes, other organizations, there were the Coalition of Visible Minority Women, the Communications Workers of Canada, and yes, so it was important to name these organizations because this was a group, and as Carolyn said, led by WWIW and IWDC, bringing this proposal forward to the March 8th Coalition. And the proposal was to make the focus of that year racism and only racism. And I just want to read a little, a few, and we do have this leaflet also. Well, the proposal, sorry, some quotes from the proposal. It is time for the feminist movement to recognize in a very public way that the struggle against racism is our struggle. We hope to use March 8th, 1986 to make a resounding statement about this. For this reason, the coalition must lead the way in efforts to build the feminist movement on an even broader basis and to bring the issue of racism to the attention of the coalition's component groups. We think it is time to put the issue of racism front and center. We propose that the central theme for March 8th be Women Say No to Racism from Toronto to South Africa. So that theme was brought forward to this group, by this group of organizations, led by WWIW and IWDC. So that's how it came to the coalition. And I think, and of course it was accepted, but having this as a theme brought more women of color into the coalition than previous years. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that was my first year. And, when I speak to women who are involved, you hear, and understandably so, you hear, wow, that was a challenging year. That was a difficult year. That was a stressful year. And it's like, oh, 1986. But for me, at least, it was an exciting year because it was a doorway into feminist organizing and politics in the city. And it was a wonderful pot, of just feminists from different communities coming together. And yes, there was struggle. And yes, there were challenges and confrontation and debate. And rightly so, women of color, and this included Indigenous women and Black women, South Asian women, this group of women of color were saying, wait a minute, how things are organized is it's not working for us. They questioned the way we questioned the way the politic of the day was determined, who was in the leadership, who determined the politic, who got invited, how did people get invited, how decisions were made. So all of these things were challenged. And I think through this challenge, through the debate, through the struggle, change began to happen in the March 8th coalition. So
before, Carolyn, can you just give us an outline of how the coalition was structured prior to this? How was it organized? How were decisions made, etc.?
It was depending on how many would be there, say 30, 40, whatever. It was coming together in a circle, and people would sort of choose, elect, whatever. I think a couple of chair people, maybe one, I'm not quite sure, and decisions were made by the group as a whole. It didn't have it didn't have a president, vice president. It didn't have any of that kind of structure in it. But it was that type of and I think decisions were made by voting, and that was my memory of how it worked. There were committees. There were a whole range of different committees would take on different tasks and report back, and that's the structure. And I think that this year was, as Judy said, so incredibly important because racism just became the entirety of the discussion, and I think it's important to note that, as Judy was saying, either it was women working with immigrant women and the Latin American Women's Collective and the other groups that she had mentioned, and IWDC. And IWDC was different from the March 8th Coalition. We ought to say that because the March 8th Coalition was at that time the name of the coalition that organized for International Women's Day. IWDC was a socialist feminist group that would be primarily white, not entirely by a long shot, but primarily white, and had a separate existence outside the March 8th Coalition. So when Judy talked about WWIW and IWDC calling this meeting, it was those two groups, which therefore obviously included women of color and racialized women, as well as white women, because that I don't think we made clear at the start.
So the March 8th Coalition then
was the coalition that organized International Women's Day. Yeah, which came together for, say, what would you say, Judy, 3 months or something like that?
Yeah.
Do that work? Yeah.
January to March.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But it did include people from both Women Working with Immigrant Women and the IWDC committee.
Correct. Yes.
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay.
Well, like other movements, the women's movement weren't inclusive. The women of color did not feel represented, did not feel included. The analysis that was put forward did not include our realities. And this is what we're talking about with the change, right? And the change that started, as we said, when WWIW joined in 1981. And it continued because, as we know, it doesn't happen quickly. So the challenge was put forward. The March 8th Coalition needed to deal with racism, needed to look at how internally it worked and how it would exclude, just by the way it worked, exclude women of color, how the way decisions were made, would not be, there wouldn't be a power balance, I guess, in the way decisions were made. Because if you had a small number of women of color as opposed to white women, and it is voting, and you're voting on an issue, well, it's the power imbalance is there. And I think that's one of the reasons, and that happened in the 1986 coalition. And that was one of the reasons the Black women, excuse me, Black women and women of color caucus was called. And this was something that we continued in the coalition as a way to, if an issue came up, it was a way to balance the power. This caucus could be called, you discuss the issue, come back to the main meeting and put forward a position. So, this is my understanding, as I think I don't know, maybe I was 24, 25 at that time. This was one of the changes that women of color pushed for. And Carolyn mentioned about the chairs. I remember another change that happened was there would be a woman of color as a chair. And then that change may have happened in 86 or maybe 87. But again, that was one of the ways to make the coalition accessible and inviting. But I think the most important thing is the analysis that was put forward, right? 86, also what started in 86 was an anti-racism education committee. And this was a committee just for white women on how to go about educating themselves. And there were no women of color in that coalition. So that in that committee, sorry. So that was something else that started. But I think what was important was through all this debate, we came to a common acceptance of what we were going to put forward as a coalition to the public on the day. And we created the leaflet for the day. And that leaflet was developed by women of color and white women, and it integrated an anti-racist perspective within that leaflet. And it's a little bit long quote, but I want to read this because it is from the leaflet. And this shows really the step forward that was being taken in 1986. We do not believe that racism is merely a misunderstanding among people, a question of interpersonal relations, or an unchanging part of human nature. It is like sexism, an integral part of the political and economic system under which we live. This system uses racism and sexism to divide us and to exploit our labor for super profits. We are shaped by racism. It gives some of us privilege, and we reproduce what it teaches us. This has to be fought in our daily lives, but we cannot just educate racism away. Even legal reforms are not enough. We must take racism to its material roots and change the economic and political structures which maintain it. Fighting racism is a feminist issue, and white women must see it as a priority. Racism distorts all of our lives. It divides and weakens us, giving power to our oppressors. Fighting racism is a feminist issue to the extent that all women are not white, and the women's movement and the labor movement are strengthened by the participation and leadership of Native, Black, Chinese, South Asian, and other women of color. We are up against strong enemies. An anti-racist analysis makes our movement broader and more powerful. Women as a whole must say no to racism, because if they come for some of us in the morning, they'll be coming for the rest of us at night. So that was on the front page of the leaflet for 1986. And that is the message and the statement that went out from the March 8th coalition. It's a huge step. And Carolyn wants to add.
Well, I just think it in itself is a powerful, powerful statement. And, I think as, we were saying, and a process had begun, with a recognition when 81 WWW and the coalition came in, and that process started to change. And through some of those years going up, at least looking back at the article that Judy and Linda Gardner and I wrote, about a third of the women were of color or immigrant women or identified as such, but not the majority by a long shot. And I think that the struggle that took place was hugely important. And the thing is, like other organizations like the National Action Committee and others, where there was a white flight, if you might want to put it that way, that didn't happen in the March 8th coalition, right? And I think people were learning and unlearning, and there was a sense that we wanted to build a movement that could make real change for all women. And if we were going to do it, then we had to do it in the most inclusive way possible. And that's what informed us. And that's why it didn't explode and do one March 8th, in 1986, and then never come back again. That was not it. That was not it. And I'm sure women always, like in any movement, some are going to stay, some are not. But there was no huge exodus of white women at all. It was a very positive and, as Judy said, sometimes very difficult, struggle. But it was hugely important, and I think it strengthened the social justice movement generally in this city, and the understanding that we are much, much stronger if we have that inclusive movement, and that is what we have to continue to build. And it, if you look at who is involved in March 8th this year or last anywhere, of all the speakers, there was one white woman that I remember who was a working class white woman from north of Etobicoke in Acorn, fighting against evictions with her her neighbors, and that change just kept on going, and hugely, hugely important, and big, big steps, making history in many senses.
Yes, and it, after 86, because, as Carolyn mentioned, women stayed, and there was a commitment, because through the summer of 86 and the fall of 86, there was a planning committee that came together to really look at what happened and to come up with a framework of restructuring the coalition. And yes, there were differences. There always will be. There were differences. But there was a common vision, a shared vision, and a shared commitment to building an anti-racist women's movement. And WWIW, as part of this team, called a one-day meeting. And at this meeting, the framework was presented and accepted. And out of this meeting, you would have the start of the 1987 March 8th Coalition. So there was acceptance of this new basis of unity, where we're recognizing that there are differences, acceptance of a group caucus method of decision-making, acceptance of who would chair meetings. So we were moving forward. And I think when the 1987 March 8th Coalition started, there were about 1/3 of its members were women of color. And you had such organizations as the South Asian Women's Group, Lesbians of Color, the Coalition of Visible Minority Women, Native Women's Association, and of course, women working with immigrant women. And that was a year in continuing to build. The theme was fighting racism and sexism together. So, the keynote speakers on that day, I'll just read a quote from the keynote speakers. Last year on International Women's Day, we said we were going to build a new women's movement in Toronto. A women's movement which does not represent and include all women cannot be called a true women's movement. An anti-racist women's movement has to include women of color, Black women, Native women. It has to address issues which affect our lives. And that speech was given by two women of color, a Black woman and myself, Indo-Caribbean woman. So here we were, speaking to the women's movement that the movement has to change and we have to be included. It's a demand. Otherwise, how could you be the women's movement? Right? It was simple as that. And this building, this integration of anti-racism, in the analysis, in the politic that went out, this linking of struggles and oppressions continued. So in 1989, the theme was women say no to racism, sexism, and economic inequality. So there again is the building. I just give another example of a theme because it raised another struggle we had. And this was in 1991, where the theme was women say stop the racist war from Oka to the Gulf. And this included issues of self-determination for Aboriginal peoples, Palestinians, and Blacks in South Africa. So amazing theme. We worked with again, quite a diverse group of women to develop this. And to think that this is the politic and the statement and the view of the women's movement that is going out on the streets in that year. It is incredible. But I have to say, a major women's organization in the city boycotted that year. And I had the phone conversation with them, so I know the reason. The reason was, well, this is not a women's issue. And we will not be a part of a march or a rally that isn't talking about women's issues.
And can you tell us who it was?
No, I don't think it's necessary. it's not necessary, because I think what's more important is it shows that that feeling was still out there, that resistance to accept that issues that affect women are women's issues, and that our lives, we are from multiple locations, and we face issues and struggles in these locations, but we experience it as women. So if we are a movement that is open to bring all women together, then the issues that we experience as women are to be women's issues. So it just illustrated that struggle continued, but this was still the March 8th coalition, the feminism, the face of feminism on the streets in the city was saying this. And I think what was important here too was we had started to influence change within other movements too, right? I think that's one of the things that is understated in the March 8th coalition, because it did influence, the whole integration and the struggles to integrate anti-racism did influence the politics of women's organizations in the city, of labor organizations in the city. So, we kind of need to underline that at times, that it played a critical role. Yeah, so I think, I'll stop there.
Can you tell us why you think it was different in Toronto, in the sense that you were able to work through these issues, form a new basis of unity and a new approach and so on, whereas other organizations, most notably NAC, were not able to do that?
Well, if I may take a stab at that, I think because most of the women were coming from an anti-capitalist perspective, if I may say that. And I think that made a huge difference. And even in the early days, if people had, as I said earlier, an intellectual, theoretical understanding of fighting racism, and certainly went to, women's strikes where immigrant women were being abused, etc., it was an appreciation that we had to learn how to integrate it in a way. I mean, capitalism deforms all of us. We're all products of the system we grow up in, and we want to tear the head off the system in many senses. But you have your own lived experience, and I think that's what you bring to any place you work, you organize, you live in. But I think if you've come to an understanding that you're fighting, the worst of sexism and gender oppression, then you appreciate that we're fighting for a world that no longer has oppression, and that's gender oppression and racial oppression and oppression, around sexuality and how you define yourself, non-binary, whatever, oppressions related to people who have disabilities. All of that, is encompassed in a system that we have to overturn. And I think that, so when you're trying to struggle for issues, and then someone points out, well, that doesn't really speak to the way I experience that issue, because I have an additional burden that is on my shoulders that you may not have felt. So it hasn't occurred to you that to take that up in a way it should, even though you may understand it theoretically. And so I think that was part of it, because people really, they weren't in it for themselves. There was no glory gain. There was no jobs to get. There was no wages paid on any of these things. People came to this as volunteers, gave a tremendous amount of their time to have a strong movement that could actually fight and win change. And if you're committed to a strong movement that it will fight and bring change, then you have to build the inclusivity, and you have to allow the people who are most affected by the exploitation and the oppression to take the leadership role, to push forward, and to knock over what has to be knocked over in the end result. And so I think that's my perspective anyway, of why okay, you listen to what's being said, and you bring it into your own thought processes. But I also think that change takes place through struggle. You know, if you're sisters in struggle, if you are comrades in arms, if you are fighting together against exploitation or oppression, however it manifests itself, you appreciate that you have to fight for your sister as well as fighting for yourself, and you learn, and you learn through this. And I think it's been a huge learning experience, and extremely positive, appreciating. I mean, you know, one can go on that, but I think personally that's the reason. People weren't attempting to make careers in this movement. People, and can't speak for everyone. I mean, who knows what's in anyone's head at any given time, but people really wanted to make lasting change, and you learn how best to do it, and you know who the people who are in it with you. And like when Judy read that piece, which was on the cover of the leaflet for March 8th, 1986, when it said, and it ended, "They'll come for us in the morning, but they'll come for you at night." Well, that says it all. And if you're not willing to fight, you know, for those who are being, you know, abused in the morning, then how are you ever going to win the world we want? And I think that was the motivation for people. And does that mean everyone took it easily, or everyone wasn't upset at one juncture? Well, you mean, obviously, you know, challenges create upset sometimes, but that is my thinking on why it's been able to maintain, and it is the largest, most continuous march and rally in the streets in all of North America. You know, and that's a huge tradition, and it's a tradition that was born out of struggle, you know, and good debate and solid debate, and differences now and again, and they'll come as they come. But that's what makes it as strong as it is, and why we have, you know, if you go, and I'm sure you have, you know, to the marches in the streets, they're the most diverse marches in the city, I would say, and that tradition is hugely important to maintain.
The March 8th Coalition continued organizing 92, 93. But in 1994, yeah, that was the year Women Working with Immigrant Women took over the organizing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know, Carolyn, do you want to speak to this, or do you want me to?
No, go right ahead.
Okay, well, you know, there wasn't, in 1994, there wasn't a group, for whatever reasons, a group coming together for the March 8th Coalition. And there was not going to be an IWD march and rally in the city. And Women Working with Immigrant Women decided, because we were one of the continuing organizations in the coalition, and we consulted, and we had the support of the organizations that were left or that were involved to take over the organizing of IWD. So in 1994, we pulled a group together of our allies within the women's movement, labor movement, the student movement, immigrant movement, women of color, and decided to organize it, because we thought the city cannot not have an IWD march and rally, because again, this is the face of the women's movement of the city. This is feminism on the streets for Toronto. And how could you not have this event? And it's not just a celebration, it is a celebration, but it's also a resistance. It is women's resistance and women's voice and women's power. That's what is on the streets on that day and at the rally. So it had to continue. So we decided to pull the group together, and that was the year the theme was reunite, resist, rise up. So that was the first year WWIW took it over. And, you know, in doing that, we also as an organization, WWIW, made a political decision that, why are we going to take this over? Well, one, of course, is to continue having this on the streets, but it was to continue the work that had been started. It was to make sure that the feminism that is presented on IWD was an anti-racist feminism, and to ensure that there was a linking of issues and a linking of the analysis, to make sure that the leadership was by women of color. And just to, I guess, yeah, just to ensure that that it was grassroots women who were represented. So we didn't have politicians speak, though it was requested at different times. We did not have top leaders of organizations speak. We tried to have women who were experiencing the issues that we were talking about on stage on the day. And then we did an outreach, we made sure and did an outreach to immigrant women's organizations and women of color organizations, anti-poverty organizations, to make sure that on the streets was a representative group of who the women are of the city and who the movement is. So that was why we, and Carolyn can add to it, but that was my memory of why we took this on.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely correct. And interestingly, I was also a member of WWIW from way back, just so I'm clear on that, because I was involved back in 1975 in helping to establish what became the Immigrant Women's Health Center because of the lack of access to good health services for women who did not speak English, et cetera, and therefore got involved with WWIW. But I think the very fact that that organization, which was primarily obviously of color and immigrant women, I was one of the few people who were white, that just speaks to more of the progression. It speaks to more of the progression that had been taking place through all that time. And it was a step by step. You see, I've never seen it as one moment. It's a process, not an event. And that's what politics is. And that is what the development of an anti-racist class perspective in the feminist movement has been all about. And, I just really feel that WWIW has played such a significant role, because it never came out, said what it had to say, and then left. It stayed and worked so hard. And Salome, if she were still in the country, would be part of this interview, because she played such a pivotal role, and a strong working class fighter, who fought racism. It was just part of her core values. And I think that it just a hugely, I'll say it again, important development that WWI took that on, and it still plays, a key role in the organizing of the event and those core values. And many of the people who come out today, and you get young women. I mean, honestly, the Coalition Against the Marcos Dictatorship, people like Carmencita Hernandez and Beli Villasan, et cetera, were back, in the early 80s and were perhaps involved before more as individuals. And today you have young women who are in their 20s from that same community fighting, the same issues. And, they did if you were at the most recent one, they did the video of a migrant worker from the Philippines speaking in Tagalog about her conditions working in a meat packing factory, and so that the tradition is, it's just so important that it continues. And young women, older women, there's just really commitment to maintain the politics that had been developed through those many years. And we want that to be the face of the women's movement in the city, because they're all competing. Like in any fight for change, there's all competing viewpoints, and getting more women in the boardrooms, and more women who are getting advanced degrees, and all of that is of course very important. But we always, as Judy said, we put the ordinary woman, the grassroots rank and file woman, on the stage, the one who rarely ever gets a chance to speak. That's always what we've done, and that's what we're continuing to do, and that's what we want to be, the face of the movement in this city. And it's been a process that I think has created a very important politic, has a respect, And because it's so large, I mean, mass organizing, getting people into the streets, if you can get thousands into the street, the media, whether they like your message or they don't like your message, they're going to have to pay attention to it. And that's how you win change. I mean, that's our view. We want to win change. We don't do this for historic purposes, or whatever else. We want to win change on those specific issues. And we know that we can, that it is the collective power of people working together that can tip the balance. We're in a very difficult time, COVID right now. It can tip the balance between winning and losing. And that's what we're committed to. And that's why we have such, I think, remarkable women, whether they've been around for decades or whether they first joined this time, just work together to build that kind of significant movement for change with an anti-racist class perspective. That's what's going to win the women's movement in the end. That's my feeling anyway.
I mean, it's been an incredible job because, it still keeps going, right?
Yes.
What do you see about, what's your trajectory about the future?
Judy?
Of IWD?
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of what excited me about being in WWIW and IW and the March 8th Coalition, and now organizing IWD. And it was this willingness to change and to grow and to listen to the perspectives of new communities, of young women coming in. And so I see this grouping, and I see WWIW continuing to organize IWD in Toronto, the IWD March and Rally. This does not mean there can't be other events, but we choose to organize this. And I see us continuing to do that and continuing to be as inclusive as possible and to learn more as we go along on how to be more inclusive, how to integrate issues more, how to be, continue to be intersectional. Just really a continuation of what we've been doing and being open to change. So we are still, I remember when a labor leader said to me, this is the largest women's march in North America. That has to continue. And I think as an organization, we take pride in that. And I think that presence on the streets and that representation of women's politic and women's life and the issues and the challenges and the celebrations have to continue. So that's what I see.
That's great.
Yeah.
Certainly evidenced, I think, by the virtual IWD on Saturday.
It was very, very exciting. And just following up on what Judy was saying, I think it was 2 years ago, the Sudanese community became involved. They brought 500 women and men out to IWD. They were in a major struggle in their home country. Women were playing a leadership role there. They had a speaker at the rally. And I think communities in struggle around the world who, have part of their community who are refugees or left for whatever reason here in Toronto, they come to International Women's Day because they want their issues highlighted. I mean, we had people from the Burmese community, for example, because of everything that's going on there, and who want to be a part of this because they see it as a fighting movement. And I think this is hugely important. I mean, some of the very strong, women who are active and have been for the last 4 or 5 years are from the Kurdish community, a very tight-knit community involved in real struggle. I mean, women fighters who fought ISIS. I mean, some are here now and they're supportive of the struggles that are going on. These are the type of women, as well as women who work in plants and work in other places, in the day-to-day struggles of today. So you get a real flavor of the international aspects and the fights and the struggles that are going on all around the world, against racism, against imperialism, against against war. And this is a place that people feel they can come and discuss, talk, and have their issues addressed. So I think I see no stop in the organizing for International Women's Day. I think the flavor of struggle, of being in the streets and harkening back, back to 1908, 1909, it is there in a way, and I think it also gives hope that working together, we have the collective power to make real change. And if you allow yourself to be inspired, by the marches in the streets, then it gives you the confidence to take up the issues that are constantly kind of be confronting us in whatever movements we're part of, because we live under capitalism, and it's a very difficult system for the ordinary working person, and wherever you find yourself. And I think that the tradition we're trying to continue, the struggles that we've been through, and we're not perfect by a long shot, but we try and bring that politics forward, and that anti-racist class perspective to a women's movement that's prepared to fight, and that's important. And I think that will be the future, hopefully.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Have we missed anything? Are there other things that you would like to touch on?
No, I think we've covered it.
I think we're okay. Yeah,
I think we really did. It was great. It was really wonderful. Thank you.
I think Judy and I would both like to say, and we said it earlier, that we would really dedicate this to Salome and the tremendous, Salome look at the tremendous role that she had played. And as we said, if she were not out of the country, she'd be speaking here and bring her perspective. But we salute her absolutely, the role she played over the many years.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.